The war in Ukraine didn't begin in 2022. It is a struggle born in the ashes of the Soviet Union, ignited in the streets of Kyiv in 2014, and now fought across the fields and cities of Ukraine. But to truly understand the war in Ukraine, we have to trace its roots through centuries of shifting borders and the promises and betrayals that set the stage for today's bloodshed. Its roots stretch back through the collapse of the Soviet Union, the annexation of Crimea, and years of shadow warfare in the Donbas. Today, it has erupted into Europe's bloodiest conflict since World War II, reshaping alliances, testing NATO's resolve, and forcing the world to reconsider what sovereignty really means in the 21st century. This isn't just a war. It's a collision of empires, past and present. Ukraine's story doesn't begin with Russia. In fact, the roots of Ukrainian identity trace back to the medieval state of Kievan Rus, a federation of Slavic tribes centered in modern-day Kyiv. This early polity flourished in the 9th to 13th centuries, long before Moscow even existed. But over centuries, Ukraine became a crossroads, partitioned between the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Ottoman Empire, and eventually the expanding Russian Empire. Under Moscow, policies of Russification sought to suppress Ukrainian language, culture, and identity. In 1922, Ukraine was absorbed into the newly formed Soviet Union. Under Stalin, the scars deepened. The Holodomor, a man-made famine in 1932, killed millions of Ukrainians. Soviet policies confiscated grain, destroyed rural economies, and crushed resistance. To this day, Ukraine regards it as genocide, an attempt to break the nation's will. After World War II, Ukraine rebuilt under Soviet control. It became a key industrial and agricultural hub of the USSR. But even as Soviet propaganda portrayed unity, resentment simmered. Ukrainian dissidents kept alive the idea of independence, often at great personal cost. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. Ukraine declared independence. But with independence came a monumental decision. Ukraine inherited the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world, around 1,900 strategic warheads. Under intense international pressure, Ukraine gave them up in exchange for guarantees. The Budapest Memorandum of 1994, signed by Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom, promised to respect Ukraine's sovereignty and existing borders. For many Ukrainians, this document symbolized security. For others, it was a gamble that history has since exposed. Through the 1990s and 2000s, Ukraine struggled between East and West. Corruption and oligarchic politics weighed heavily. But with each passing year, ties with Europe deepened. Ukrainian leaders pursued closer relations with the European Union. NATO expansion eastward, from Poland to the Baltics, alarmed Moscow. For Russia, NATO's approach to its borders wasn't just geopolitics, it was existential. Vladimir Putin, rising to power in 1999, made clear. Ukraine joining NATO was a red line. To the Kremlin, Ukraine was not just another neighbor. It was the cradle of Slavic civilization, the buffer state separating Russia from the West, and the heart of its post-Soviet identity. In 2004, Ukraine erupted in the Orange Revolution, mass protests against election fraud that tried to hand victory to the pro-Russian candidate Viktor Yanukovych. The protests succeeded. The election was rerun, and the pro-Western Viktor Yushchenko took office instead. But the revolution didn't erase Ukraine's divide. It only hardened it. A westward-looking Ukraine on one side, and a Russia determined not to lose influence on the other. Yet Yanukovych would return. By 2010, he had staged a political comeback and won the presidency. 3 years later, in 2013, he abandoned plans to sign an association agreement with the European Union, choosing closer ties with Russia instead. That decision lit the fuse. Ukrainians flooded the streets in what became known as Euromaidan, or the Revolution of Dignity. What began as peaceful demonstrations turned into months of bloody clashes with riot police. By February 2014, Yanukovych fled to Russia. A pro-Western interim government took over. And in Moscow, Putin saw not democracy, but a coup orchestrated by the West. His response would change Ukraine and the world forever. Within days of Yanukovych's fall, unidentified armed men in green uniforms seized buildings in Crimea. Russia denied involvement, but the world knew these were Russian troops. Within weeks, Crimea held a referendum under occupation, claiming overwhelming support for joining Russia. The international community rejected it. But in Moscow, the map had changed. Crimea was annexed, giving Russia control of Sevastopol's naval base and the Black Sea's gateway. Meanwhile, in eastern Ukraine's Donbas region, separatist movements, heavily supported by Moscow, declared people's republics. Ukraine's army, ill-prepared, launched counteroffensives. The war became a grinding conflict. Thousands died between 2014 and 2021. Attempts at peace, like the Minsk agreements, faltered. This frozen war was Moscow's strategy: destabilize Ukraine, prevent NATO integration, keep Ukraine locked in conflict. Then on February 24, 2022 at 5 a.m., Putin announced a special military operation. Minutes later, missiles struck Ukrainian cities. Russian tanks rolled across borders from Belarus, Russia, and occupied Crimea. The Kremlin expected Ukraine to collapse in days. Instead, they held firm. President Volodymyr Zelensky refused evacuation, declaring, "I need ammunition, not a ride." Its defiance galvanized a nation and the world. NATO nations unleashed unprecedented sanctions, freezing Russian assets, cutting banks from SWIFT, banning tech exports. The United States and EU poured billions in weapons: Javelin missiles, HIMARS rocket systems, Patriot defenses. Britain, Germany, Poland, and Canada sent tanks, drones, and training. Meanwhile, Russia turned to Iran for drones, to North Korea for artillery shells, and leaned on China for economic lifelines. Within months, millions fled Ukraine. The largest refugee wave in Europe since World War II, Poland, Germany, and others took in millions. Cities across Europe absorbed Ukrainians, students, families, the elderly, while soldiers stayed behind to fight. And now, here we are in 2025. The war in Ukraine is no longer just about two countries. It has become a global conflict, fought through weapons, sanctions, and alliances. On one side, NATO and the West have invested billions to ensure Ukraine survives. On the other, Russia has turned to a mix of old allies and unlikely new partners, states willing to defy sanctions and feed Moscow's war machine. Ukraine's survival depends on international support. Since 2022, the United States has committed more than $75 billion in aid, ranging from anti-tank javelins and HIMARS rocket systems to Abrams tanks and Patriot air defenses. Intelligence sharing has been just as critical. American satellites and drones provide Ukrainian commanders with real-time battlefield awareness that has kept Kyiv standing against a numerically larger Russian army. Europe, too, has stepped up. The EU imposed sweeping sanctions on Russian energy and banking, while member states opened their borders to millions of Ukrainian refugees. Poland and the Baltic states became Ukraine's frontline lifeline, hosting bases for training, transporting weapons, and in some cases, donating their own Soviet-era tanks and aircrafts, so Ukrainians could use familiar systems immediately. Germany, once hesitant, reversed decades of policy by rearming itself and sending Leopard tanks. Britain supplied Storm Shadow cruise missiles and elite training. Canada invested more than $2 billion in weapons, humanitarian aid, and training conscripts on NATO bases. Even smaller nations like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, countries that know firsthand what Russian occupation means, gave disproportionately large shares of their defense budgets to keep Ukraine armed. Meanwhile, Nordic nations like Finland and Sweden, neutral for generations, joined NATO outright, citing Ukraine's plight as proof that Russia remained an existential threat to European security. Their entry reshaped the map of NATO itself, creating a united northern front stretching across the Arctic. But Ukraine is not alone in receiving help. Russia, too, has forged a wartime coalition. Some allies are expected, others are surprising. Belarus, under Alexander Lukashenko, offered its territory as a launchpad for Russia's assault on Ukraine in 2022. Belarusian factories help maintain Russian equipment, and Minsk remains a political echo chamber for the Kremlin's messaging. Further east, North Korea became one of Moscow's strangest yet most reliable suppliers. Kim Jong-un's regime has provided artillery shells, rockets, and even reportedly sent military specialists to advise Russian units. Rumors suggest tens of thousands of North Korean troops may be prepared to deploy if Moscow demands it. For Pyongyang, the partnership is transactional. Food, fuel, and advanced weapons technology flow back in return. And then there is Iran. Tehran has supplied Shait suicide drones, cheap, deadly weapons that terrorize Ukrainian cities almost nightly. Russia now manufactures these drones on its own soil, thanks to Iranian designs and engineers. In exchange, Moscow provides Tehran with advanced aircraft and missile technology, tightening a dangerous military partnership. China's role is more complicated. Officially, Beijing claims neutrality, calling for peace talks. In practice, China has become Russia's economic lifeline. Chinese companies provide dual-use technology, microchips, and commercial drones that end up in Russian arsenals. Trade between the two nations has surged. China buys discounted Russian oil and gas, while Russia uses Chinese markets to bypass Western sanctions. Yet Beijing has avoided supplying direct lethal aid, cautious not to trigger Western retaliation. Smaller states have also declared loyalty. Syria, Nicaragua, Cuba, nations dependent on Russian backing, publicly support Moscow's position and in some cases recognize the annexation of Ukrainian territory. They may not send troops or tanks, but their diplomatic weight reinforces Russia's narrative of a divided world order. Between these two camps lies a third, the fence-sitters. Dozens of countries have refused to choose sides, balancing moral condemnation with cold pragmatism. India continues to buy Russian oil at steep discounts, while calling for dialogue. Turkey sells drones to Ukraine while keeping trade ties with Moscow. Brazil and South Africa, as part of the BRICS bloc, speak of multipolarity, arguing that the war proves the West's dominance must end. In Africa and the Middle East, responses are just as mixed. Some states remember Soviet support during their own independence struggles and maintain ties with Russia. Others depend on Ukrainian grain to feed their populations and demand an end to the blockade of Black Sea exports. For many, neutrality is survival. This is the world in 2025, divided not only by front lines in Ukraine, but by supply chains, sanctions, and shifting allegiances. A regional war has become a global litmus test, forcing every country to ask where it stands. With the war dragging into its fourth year, the question becomes, what is truly at stake? For Ukraine, the stakes are existential. For Russia, they are imperial. And for the world, they are nothing less than the rules of international order. For Ukraine, the war is not optional. It is survival. Every missile strike, every trench dug into its farmland is a reminder that independence is not guaranteed. Ukraine's goals are clear. Reclaim its sovereign territory, including Donbas and Crimea, secure its place in the European Union and NATO, and prove to the world that even against overwhelming odds, a democracy can resist authoritarian conquest. Beyond territory, Ukraine fights for identity. For centuries, Moscow claimed Ukrainians were not a separate people, but simply Little Russians. The war has shattered that narrative. Every day of resistance cements Ukrainian identity as distinct, proud, and unyielding. Russia frames the war differently. For the Kremlin, Ukraine is not just a neighbor. 'Tis the front line of a struggle against NATO and the West. Putin has insisted that NATO expansion is a betrayal of post-Cold War promises, and that Ukraine's western drift threatens Russia's security. But deeper than that is history. To Putin, the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. The war is his attempt to reverse it, to rebuild influence, secure Crimea as a permanent naval stronghold, and ensure Ukraine never joins NATO. Russia's stakes are not only military, but political. Victory, or even a frozen conflict that cements territorial gains, allows Putin to present himself as the protector of Russian-speaking peoples, the restorer of empire. Defeat, however, could unravel his regime. But the stakes extend beyond Russia and Ukraine. For Europe, the war tests the credibility of NATO's collective defense. For the United States, it is a proving ground for its commitment to allies and its ability to counter authoritarian powers. For China, it is a preview of how the West might respond if Beijing ever moved on Taiwan. Economic stakes are just as high. The war disrupted global food supplies, spiked energy prices, and forced countries to rethink dependence on single suppliers. The longer it drags on, the more it reshapes trade, security, and the global balance of power. Yet, at the heart of it all are human beings. Millions of Ukrainians remain displaced. Cities like Mariupol lie in ruins. Thousands of Russian conscripts have died in trenches they never wanted to fight in. Each side measures gains and losses in territory. But for ordinary people, the cost is measured in lives, families, and futures lost. This is why the world watches Ukraine. Because the outcome of this war is more than lines on a map. It will define whether the 21st century is ruled by law or by force. Talks continue. Russia demands recognition of annexed lands. Ukraine insists on full withdrawal. Western powers float security guarantees, troops on the ground, air defenses, permanent aid packages, but trust is shattered. Both sides are dug in. This war is not just about Ukraine. It's about whether borders can be changed by force, whether international law means anything, and whether democracy can survive in the shadow of empire. Ukraine's fight is the world's fight. And until peace comes, the question remains: who will decide the future of Europe, the people who live there, or the powers that seek to control them? If you found this breakdown helpful, make sure to hit the like button. And if you want more deep dives into world history, global conflicts, and the forces shaping our future, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one.